You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And today we're going to give a little more clarity, or at least for me, because I don't really know what happened, on the nuclear disasters that have happened based on some of the comments we had in our previous episode. So speaking about 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. I say Chernobyl, you say...
Chernobyl.
I don't. You're probably right.
No. It's just there's. I don't know if there's any one way. I mean, I think there's lots of place names that get pronounced differently depending upon your culture, what continent you live on. So.
Yeah, for sure.
The place in Ukraine.
Yes.
That had the big disaster when it was part of the Soviet Union.
Yes, correct. And then Fukushima from Japan, where our most recent nuclear disaster. And the thing that kind of compels me about these is even though they're localized, they can have global effects.
Oh, absolutely.
And they're scary.
And I think one of the reasons why they tend to be scary is that it has to do with invisible stuff. I mean, when my mom would talk about her son who became a particle physicist, she would tell everybody, "Oh, he just studies invisible things." And I think a lack of information and a lack of understanding and knowledge is inherently scary.
Yeah, I mean, I work in molecular biology, so it's all invisible too until you get really high-powered microscopes. So I'm used to the invisible world.
Absolutely. But,
well,
maybe we can make some of this visible to those of you listening today.
And I think, okay, so maybe just basics. I'll lay out of what radiation does to the human body. So the reason
helps you grow bigger and superpowers, I think.
In the comic books, yes, radioactive spiders and all that. But in reality, the reason that radioactivity is dangerous for the human body or any living tissue is that it causes basically double-strand breaks in DNA. So that ionizing radiation, whatever goes in, causes your DNA, which should have continuous sequences to be read for your genes, to get chopped up in half. The cell scrambles. It says, I don't know what ends go together. I'm going to guess. And it tries its best. And if it's chopped up way too much, it can't guess properly. The cell dies. So things that get affected first are the most rapidly dividing cells, which is why we can use radiation therapies to treat cancer, sort of like hitting a tumor with a sledgehammer and being like, hope the healthy cells don't die too. But so
this is cool. I've never actually heard it described in the way that you just did. That's really awesome. Thank you for sharing that with me. It makes me wonder, when you chop up the DNA and it makes a guess as to how it put it back together again, if it puts back together incorrectly, can that potentially create things like
cancer?
Yes.
So definitely, if the cell is able to salvage itself, you are more susceptible to having mutations that could lead to cancer or cause the cell to die eventually. When you have enough double-strand breaks, the cell cannot save itself. So when your cells are dying and they're not able to replicate and replace themselves because their DNA is so damaged, then you start getting those. If you've seen any pictures of people who have been affected by like the nuclear bombs or whatever, your skin starts peeling off, your hair is falling out. It's just disastrous.
That's just the cells that are all dying.
Mm-hmm. And they can't get replaced. So eventually you die, and it's kind of slow and painful.
Wow.
It can be fast and painful.
To be avoided.
Yes, is not desirable. Radiation therapy for cancer treatments is more targeted than chemotherapy because you just radiate a specific area. So that's a little bit better. But if a tumor is spread throughout, then chemotherapy is giving poison to the whole body and trying to kill cancer first before you kill healthy cells. But most of our cancer therapies at this point are toxic.
Wow. I was like, I'm trying to think of something to say to that. But I've always thought of chemotherapy as it's a last ditch in some sense.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have anything else to do. So what we're going to try to do is kill the cancer. But to kill the cancer, we're also going to have to hurt you badly.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll get rid of the cancer before we hurt the rest of you. Too badly that you're not going to make it. So it's a trade-off.
Right. So basically, the reason that I get scared with nuclear bombs, who doesn't, and nuclear energy is that the potential side effects can be so damaging to health and life and have really long-term effects. So if we want to go in historical order, we can start with 3 Mile Island. I know very little about this other than it wasn't nearly as bad as the other two, but people still in the community felt lied to and had exposure. But what happened, Chris?
Yes. So this was the first accident of a nuclear reactor that the world became aware of. There probably were accidents associated with military or government reactors that we just don't know much about. But this was a publicly operated facility. And it turned out that there were, as is always the case, a series of unfortunate events that led up to the partial meltdown of the reactor core at 3 Mile Island. The first thing to remember is that the reactors have two water systems, two water circulation systems. The primary water circulation system is removing the heat from the reactor core that's being generated from the fission processes and the radioactive decay of the isotopes produced from the fission. And that gets pumped out of the reactor core into a thermal exchange unit. And then you have a secondary water system, which is absorbing the heat from the heat exchanger and then using that heat to generate steam, which drives a turbine to generate electricity. It's just the basic way to think about it. So you have the heat that's being generated in the core, which gets taken out and then exchanged through a heat exchanger. And then the water between these two systems never actually touch. That way, you can keep the water that's going through the core isolated and contained.
Because it's going to be radioactive.
It can pick up some stuff. It can also become tritiated. You know, the hydrogen in the water can absorb neutrons and become tritium. So the idea is it's just best practice to keep these water systems separate. So the 3 Mile Island accident happened when the secondary circulation system failed. And whether it was an electrical system or a mechanical failure, I don't remember exactly what caused that secondary water system to fail, but it did.
Human error. I don't know if that's true, but that's often the case.
Well, I guess everything ultimately comes down to human error because humans designed all of the electrical systems and the mechanical systems, and so if something fails, then clearly it almost always is because somebody overlooked something or they did something. Regardless, so the circulation of the secondary system, which is helping take the heat out of the primary reactor core, stopped working, and as a consequence, they had an increase in temperature and an increase in pressure inside the primary system. Because if you're not taking the heat out, then you're going to build up. So they have a relief valve. So as the pressure, and it's okay, they design for these things. So as the pressure of the interior...
okay is a stretch, but I'll take it.
So as the pressure starts to go up, there's a relief valve at the top, which would allow some of the pressure and the steam from the primary system to escape to maintain, the pressure so that they could continue pumping the water. And then even though the primary, and the reactor shut down, everything worked the way it was supposed to. The reactor shut down. It's, the fission processes cease, but there's still energy.
So the control rods drop in?
Yes, the control rods all dropped in. Everything was fine with that regard. And so then what they just keep doing is they just keep circulating that water through the reactor core, and so as the heat, you can't take as much heat out as before, but you can still take the heat out, some of it, enough that it keeps the reactor from melting. Well, it turned out that the relief valve that was letting the pressure out, and it's you let the pressure out and the relief valve closes, and then if it gets high again, you let the pressure out and the relief valve closes. Well, it got stuck open, and the problem is not that it necessarily that got stuck open, but that the control in the control room, the instrumentation said that it had closed. So the operators who were controlling the situation thought that the relief valve had actually closed when it had not. So ultimately what ended up happening is the steam kept pouring out of this relief valve.
So you lost all your cooling water?
Not all of it, but enough. And so then other indicators were with this valve open, things started behaving in a strange way. And so then the operators were confused because they were like, wait a minute, this shouldn't be happening. How can this be true? They were getting contradictory messaging. So when one of the sensors failed and was telling them inaccurate or invalid data, when they take that data, invalid data, and compare it with other data they were getting, it was didn't make much sense.
Right.
So then they're trying to figure all this out. And in the process of trying to figure out what's actually happening, the water level inside the reactor core dropped down to the point where some of the fuel got exposed, was no longer cooled sufficiently, and it started to melt. They eventually were able to figure out what was happening and rectify the situation before it got too bad.
Right.
And then they stabilized. They had to release some noble gases that were slightly radioactive, and they dissipated into the atmosphere, which is some of the release of the radioactive. When you talk about there's a release of radioactivity, it wasn't the really dangerous kind. It was the kind that would just go off into the atmosphere, dissipate, and then it would be gone. And there's always radiation naturally in the environment anyway. So most people would say, well, it wasn't a big deal. Well, people will say, well, you released radioactivity. Yes, bananas are radioactive too. So it's just a matter.
Yeah, but when you're buying a house, you don't want to buy it right next to the nuclear power plant.
So it's similar to think about radon. Radon gas is radioactive as well, and radon gas is dangerous if it concentrates in your basement.
Which is why we have abatement.
Which basically takes that radon gas and just vents it into the atmosphere.
Right.
And then once it's into the atmosphere, people are saying, well, we don't care anymore. And so it was a similar type of a situation where they were taking this noble gas that was being produced, and then to release pressure in the systems, they were releasing that noble gas. All the other radioactive isotopes were contained within the 3 Mile Island plant and was eventually cleaned up.
Did the people surrounding it have any health effects?
It's not definitively yes.
Okay.
So
I'm sure people are like, yes, I do, who lived there. And then people say, hey, it might be correlative, not causative.
Right. And so it's challenging to find a definitive study which says, yes, as a consequence of this, there were these health effects. Generally, the articles that I've seen basically say that, nobody was negatively impacted, no deaths, no, severe illnesses. But again, different people have different ideas about that.
So is 3 Mile Island, did it get completely shut down after that?
That particular reactor was shut down, cleaned up, and decommissioned. But the rest of the facility was just fine.
Okay. So once you put in the control rods, can you never bring that reactor back up?
Well, the issue with that particular one is that the core melted, part of the core melted, which basically meant it was inoperable at that point.
Okay.
You could never use it again.
So going to Chernobyl, we might have an extra long episode if we're
okay.
going to cover all of them. So going to Chernobyl, my understanding was they were doing some sort of testing on it where they were reducing the amount of power the reactor was producing for some sort of test. Something down the line, they said they couldn't bring it back up yet, so they left it too low for too long.
So we talked already about 3 Mile Island. You have to continually cool the reactor core.
Right.
They were doing a test as what would happen if they went into island mode, which basically means that there's no power coming from the outside. And you have to keep the water pumps running just using your own power.
Okay.
And so then the question is if you shut the reactor down and then try to use the energy that's being generated through the reactor itself to drive the water pumps, how long would you be able to do that in a safe fashion? So
and the answer is not as long as they did.
Well, there was a lot of mistakes that were made, and this is definitely a human error situation. In the lead up to this test, they did a lot of things which created some neutron poisons inside the reactor core, so that when it came time to actually do the test, where they wanted to bring the power level of the reactor back up, these neutron absorbers that were in the reactor core, as a consequence of the way that they had been operating the core for the past day, meant that they had to pull the control rods much farther out than they would have normally expected to in order to get the power level, the output power level from the reactor to get to the point where they could run their test.
Right.
So they had to pull all of the control rods out. They got to the power level they wanted, and they did the test, and then they were going to try to turn things off. But as a consequence of the design of the control rods, the control rods were all out. There was some poison which was causing the reactor to behave in a non-standard, non-traditional way. And the reactor control rods were designed such that there was a little part of the control rod that, as it was sliding back in, would cause a spike in output power. And as they were putting the control rods back in, there was this spike in output power. You could have almost have predicted it. I read one article that basically said that this reactor design was, in some sense, designed to fail because it had this little feature associated with it. The spike in power output generated some steam because it was just a pulse of energy which caused the water that was in the reactor core to flash the steam. The flashing to steam generated a very high internal pressure, which kind of dislodged the cap for the reactor core.
Oh, okay.
And then as a consequence of this, also the high pressure damaged the interior of the reactor core, which led to additional power surges, which led to additional steam, which led to higher pressures, which then led to the destruction of the reactor core.
Right, the top blew off,
The top blew off. And then there was a second explosion. And the sources that I've read say that there's some controversy as to what the second explosion was. But the second explosion basically then took much of the contents of the reactor core, and now that the top is gone, spewed it into the environment. So the second one could have been a hydrogen explosion. It could have been another steam explosion. But basically, it took all of that, the fuel rods and the graphite associated with the reactor core, and then sent it up and out of the reactor into the surrounding communities.
Yeah, and then it was the radioactivity coming from there was so strong. Had they not cleaned it up, it would have. Or I don't know. I'm basing most of what I know off of the HBO special, so it's probably highly accurate. But it seemed like there was risk to not only Chernobyl itself, but a lot of other surrounding communities and water contamination issues.
Well, the West found out about it because this was Soviet Russia. The West found out about it because radiation monitors in Sweden were going off, in Scandinavia were going off.
Right.
And so some of the isotopes were getting up into the atmosphere and being carried around through wind patterns, weather patterns. Right. And then it became quickly clear what was going on. Satellite imagery, figured out that, hey, wait a minute, why is your reactor building on fire?
And they were like, nothing to see here.
And that was one of the challenges is they were using graphite as a moderator, and the graphite caught fire and was burning. And so then the smoke, in some sense, from the fire was also helping distribute the radioactive isotopes.
And then they put a dome over Chernobyl, correct?
They did eventually. So the first thing that they had to do, and this is where a lot of the people died, they brought in workers, presumably volunteers, to basically start dumping sand and lead and anything else they could get on top of the open reactor core, just to basically cover it up. If you think about it, if you have a campfire on the beach, just start shoveling sand on top of it.
Right.
And so the goal was just to smother it by having literally helicopters fly over and just dump stuff into the reactor building until they dumped enough stuff on top of it that it would be covered. And then once it was covered, now you can start to do longer term planning, and they built a sarcophagus around it, and then they built another sarcophagus to replace the first one.
I heard there was a problem with the second one because the first one had like cracks and flaws, so like it was you had some exchange with the environment, but then when they put the second one on, it trapped everything better and heat started increasing, and they started seeing some reactions again. Is that correct?
Well, there's always going to be some heat associated with radioactive decay. Yeah. It's not going to be fission. In order to achieve a chain reaction, the conditions have to be precise. But what's likely true is that there's just enough radioactive material left that the radioactive decay from that is generating heat that needs to be taken out. In some sense, the reason the core of the Earth is molten is because of radioactive decay of the radioactive isotopes that are in the core of the Earth. So yes, you will get some heat. I'm sure that it's to the point where they can, in some sense, control it. I think there's things that they can do. It shouldn't be to the point where they can't do something about it.
Right. So and I think a lot of people who lived in the city ended up dying, or at least getting cancer eventually.
So I was looking this up, and they basically said they attributed 5,000 thyroid cancers.
Okay.
of which 15 of those people died. 30 people died as a result of the accident, 2 from the explosions, and 28 more from acute radiation poisoning as they were trying to cover up the reactor core.
Right.
So the military and the volunteers who were, shoveling sand on top of the
In
reactor
Russia
pile.
and Soviet Union, the quote-unquote volunteers, I
Yes.
think they might have been voluntold.
Yeah, possibly. But it was important for them to get that thing covered up as quickly as they did. So it was, in some sense, the people that died were in fact heroes.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And the square footage, so I mentioned that the contents of the reactor core were spewed over the landscape. The exclusion zone right now is 1,000 square miles,
Oh, wow.
which is like 33 miles by 33 miles square. If you
Yeah,
want
but
to put it
that's
that way.
huge.
And so for comparison, I was looking up Cook County, where Chicago resides, is 1,600 square miles. So it would be, roughly 60% of Cook County is what the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl reactor is.
And now you can do tourism there. There's
I would not.
yeah. I don't know. I think I might. You wear radioactive detection
It
badges,
doesn't matter
and
to me.
yeah, you can only go in for a certain number of hours.
Why would you want to why would that be a tourist spot?
Because the whole urban exploration thing.
I don't know.
I don't know. There's a part of me that's interested, but that's the part of me that still thinks I'm immortal. Left over from being a teenager. Just kidding.
I've seen pictures. I don't need to go visit.
Yeah. And then Fukushima, our last major.
Fukushima was completely preventable. And again, it has everything to do with this circulating of cooling water. So the reactor basically survived the earthquake, no problem. So as a consequence of this massive earthquake, there was literally no damage to the reactors. And in fact, they all responded correctly, and all the reactors, the control rods were dropped, the fission reactions were stopped, and the plant was simply coasting and cooling down until the tsunami waves came. And when the tsunami waves came, it turned out that it knocked out the electric power.
Sure.
So there is no more, there is no power coming into the facility from the outside. And it knocked out all of the diesel generators to create electric power inside of the facility, because the diesel generators were
Low level, where they would flood.
Yes.
Okay.
So it was one of those situations where, in retrospect, if you had put the diesel generators on the roof of the building, none of this would have happened. So they had designed the facility to withstand a tsunami of a particular size.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were like, well, the probability of a tsunami greater than this is so small that we're going to put we're going to leave the diesel generators and the backup power jet systems behind the tsunami wall. Well, fine. Well, they had an event which exceeded their design, so their power systems were flooded and failed, so they had no ability to circulate water through the reactor core. So even though the control rods were in, we had already talked about how the radioactive decay of the byproducts that exist due to the fission processes that happened over the past 5 days, 10 days. So those byproducts are still decaying and producing heat. And with no circulation, they couldn't take the heat out. It vaporized all the water that was in the core, exposed the core. The core melted, and then went through the bottom of the reactor facility, the containment building, and into the basement of the facility.
Yikes. And I remember, wasn't there a radioactive cloud that was traveling across the ocean towards the United States from this?
I don't know the details of that. It's not something which is commonly discussed. So my conclusion from a scientific perspective is if I don't see a lot of traffic, it probably is not as significant as other issues.
Yeah. I thought they were just detecting isotopes in California, but
I think
could
you
be
probably
wrong.
can, but the capability of detecting isotopes from a scientific perspective is so precise.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, it went from 1 part in 5 trillion to 5 parts in 5 trillion. Okay, it's still not a big deal.
Yeah. But nobody wants to be exposed unnecessarily. So, yeah, I think that people have a hard time understanding with probability, even if it's a 1% chance or a 0.1% chance. It doesn't mean it's impossible.
That's true.
It just means that it's a larger chance it doesn't happen, but there's still a chance it will happen.
And as we've said on this podcast in the past, cancer is oftentimes just a roll of the dice.
Yep. What mutations you get are determine if that cell acquires the properties necessary to become cancerous. Plus, we have immune systems that are killing off cells that pop up that are mutants and potentially cancerous all the times in our body. Like, we have cells designed to prevent cancer in our immune system.
Exactly.
So,
well, I certainly hope that some of these descriptions of what happened help people have a clearer understanding of how these accidents occurred.
Human error. So the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Lewis University. The material and information presented here is for the general information purposes only. The Lewis University name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and it does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. This podcast was produced in the WLRA podcast studios at Lewis University. Visit lewisu.edu for more information about Lewis University. You've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
Have a good one.
See you later. Bye.